Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. As of this recording, it is March 23rd, 2026. Thanks for tuning back in. It's been a little while, as usual. Luckily for me, not a whole lot has changed in life. And lucky for us, this tale is a tale that's already written. So we have all the time in the world to dig it up and rehash it. So hopefully you guys notice a little bit of a change in my audio sound. I am now recording on the Shure MV7 Plus microphone. My mother-in-law got it for me for Christmas. I just got this thing set up. Part of the reason it took me so long to get back to recording is I had a component break on my Zoom PodTrack P4, which is the interface between the microphone and the computer. I won't bore you with the technical details, but everything's up and running now, and I'm excited to get us into Operation Lorraine and hopefully rebound from what my boy has called the worst episode I've ever produced. Just kidding. He didn't say it in those words, but apparently the last episode was a big dud, and, I think it kind of was. I won't name names, Ryan, but I was accused of reading a AI-generated script that was the first time I had seen it. I'm honored that you thought my script, which I did write myself, was as good as what could be produced in a nanosecond by the greatest invention of computing power that humanity has ever known. But no, I did write it myself. And my thought process was, hey, if I write it all out and I just read it, then it'll save me a lot of time, because when I read it, I'll read it as it sounds in my head when I wrote it, and everybody will think it's great, and I won't have to go back through and edit as much. Obviously that was not the case, and it's true. The last episode didn't sound that great. I spent a lot of time reading and not a lot of time recording, if that makes any sense. So hopefully I can redeem myself in this episode. It's kind of a shame because the last episode was a pretty crazy tale. Quick recap, General Giap had basically initiated 3 operations to regain control of the Red River Delta. Each one involved 10,000 or more troops swarming down from the hills and attempting to overrun French strong points, standing in the way of them and the Red River Delta. And just for recollection's sake, the Red River Delta is where the capital of Hanoi and the port city of Haiphong are. It's also a huge rice production area and really vital to the French economic concerns. Similar in the south, which in the series of this podcast, we have really not touched upon southern Vietnam much, because the truth is, in southern Vietnam at this time, the Viet Minh didn't have as much ability to affect any kind of serious resistance. And in the south, the city down there that's kind of the equivalent of Haiphong is Saigon. And instead of the Red River Delta in the south, it's called the Mekong Delta. And it's also a big rice production area. And between southern Vietnam and northern Vietnam, obviously, is a long coastline on the east, but then up all along the west, along the border with Cambodia and Laos, is a bunch of mountains and hills. All right, so that's a quick down and dirty of the terrain. But anyway, so the General Giap had not had much success going straight into the Red River Delta due to French air superiority and artillery. So eventually he says, hey, we're going to stick with what we have best, which is mobility in the jungle. The thick jungle canopy makes it hard for the air recon to spot them. Also, it's brutal terrain that the French can't maneuver their vehicles. So while the French did have a lot of fire superiority, tanks, armed troop transport, that kind of thing, it doesn't do them a whole lot of good if they can only get through the roads. The Vietnamese, they can disappear into the woods. They can move fast because they're light, and they can blend in with the villages. And the villagers also, a lot of them were engaged in a countrywide effort to either directly support the troops or to support the logistics of the troops. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track, but as a result of General Giap's 3 failed attempts at hitting the Red River Delta and taking back control of Hanoi, he said, hey, we're going to push west. He mobilized 3 full divisions along a 30-mile front and basically started pushing generally southwest towards the Laotian border. And in the process, overran basically every single outpost that stood in their way. It got to the point where the French military said, we got to do something. We got to sacrifice some to save the many. So they sacrificed the 6th Parachute Battalion under the command of Major Bigard, who ends up being a true hero that goes down in the history books of French military history. And so, long story short, the 6th is parachuted in to make a stand at Tuli, and by doing so, they bought some time for the surrounding outposts to fall back to the Black River, as it's called. They basically paid in blood and troops, obviously. 60% casualty rate. It was a harrowing tale. Unfortunately, I probably didn't do a good enough job articulating how great of a testament of human endurance that story really was, but they sacrificed themselves in large part so that others could live, and it resulted in the ability for the French to fall back far enough that they could set up somewhat of a defensive line against the Vietnamese. Now, that leaves us with what happens next, and what happens next is something called Operation Lorraine. But first, you might be asking yourself, well, okay, cool, like, why does the French have any interest in Western Vietnam? What's in northwestern Vietnam? The answer is its proximity to the Laotian border. At this point in time, Laos was still a French protectorate, I think is probably the best way to describe it. And it had not succumbed to the predations of the communists. It was a big concern, though, because the French thought, hey, if the Vietnamese communists get their claws in Laos, we're going to lose out on a lot of money. I mean, that's what it really came down to for the French, was money. Either the money that they're going to need to spend to help the Laotian government regain control, and also the money lost on production of goods and services that came out of Laos, least of which was opium, which was a big export in that region. I guess the climate in that Western Vietnam and Eastern Laos zone is like extremely great for opium production. And the DRV, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, as you'll recall, the DRV's consideration was, hey, not only is opium great for our purposes because they utilized it as a means of buying stuff off the black market in Hong Kong and Thailand, but also the more political momentum that they could gain in the region, right, in Cambodia and Laos, but in this case, Laos specifically, then even better, right? Because they've already got Chinese backing to the north, major communist brothers to the north. And as we're going to see in this episode, Soviet blockade was starting to flow. So you've got the 2 biggest communist countries in the world backing you. And, what better than having some communist brothers on your western border, right? So the French obviously understood that that's a big deal. So there's Laos, but also there is what's called the Thai Hill Country or the Thai Highlands. And this area is populated with ethnic Thais, presumably people who, through the course of history, migrated from Thailand. But as far as they're concerned, they are a distinct people, not related to the Vietnamese per se. I'm not a anthropologist. I don't know the nuances. They consider themselves culturally distinct, and their history, being where they are in proximity to Laos and China, it's one of those long, crazy tales of, human diversity. But regardless, they had historically been at least friendly associates with the French. A lot of them were outright allies and fought with the French in this case. But it was important for the French to maintain their alliance with the Thai Hill Country. And if they lost that, it was going to be a major strategic defeat because of the proximity to Laos. For the Thai Hill Country people, as far as they're concerned, they're kind of caught in between two powerful and aggressive forces, the Viet Minh under General Giap and, fighting on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, and the French colonial rulership, which in this case, the top dog general was a guy named General Raoul Celan. So General Celan said, hey, you know what? We got to do something. We got to do some sort of operation to divert General Giap away from this region. And the only way we're going to get him to do that is if we assault his rear echelon and supply lines. If your supply lines, which at this point extend up into China, are being coalesced outside the Red River Delta and then distributed, all throughout the region to the various Viet Minh troops, start getting attacked by the French, and the French start seizing major depots of weapons and ammunition. Theoretically, you're going to say, oh man, we got to do something about this. I need to divert a significant portion of troops to go deal with that. And that would reduce their presence in this western region. And not only would they be diverted away from there, but the hope, which was the continuous hope of the French throughout this entire conflict, was that at a certain point, they would draw General Giap's forces into a set-piece battle where French fire superiority would decimate them to the point where they basically either had to call it quits altogether or, more realistically, as is in pretty much every war, yeah, they could keep fighting, but it's not worth it. They can go to the negotiating table and neither party will come out super happy with the result of the negotiations, but the French would come out on top. That was the hope. So thus, the high risk, high reward gamble known as Operation Lorraine. So Operation Lorraine is known as being one of the more complicated plans in this entire war. It involved 30,000 troops, French troops, and it was to unfold over the course of 3 specified stages with 1 optional stage. Now, before I go any further into the details, I'm just going to note here that this is a really rather complicated operation. It's not super complicated in concept, but to try to articulate the ongoings of this in a podcast without visual aids is really not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for me. So I've distilled it down to the basics. I'm going to give you the high level overview of what happens. That's really all you need. If you really want details on this whole war in general, I really recommend that you read Street Without Joy. It's considered, I think, by a lot of people the go-to French Indochina 101 book. Like I've said before many times in this podcast, The author of that book, Bernard B. Fall, was, considered like the preeminent historian in the United States on this war. He ends up dying in Vietnam with the United States Marines. He was attached and he stepped on a bouncing Betty. So he's the real deal. Like, it's a lot of the stuff that you're going to read online about this war. The details are gathered by him. He's the one who wrote about them in the first place. He was there in Indochina and he talked to a lot of people. So anyway, for details, read that book. Also, I'll note that this series on French Indochina is coming to an end soon. We're almost to the end. I'm gonna cut out some of the more less relevant, but there's a lot of cool stories. Like, there's a ton of cool stories in this war that we're not gonna get to, because it's time to get to the war in Vietnam, United States entry. My buddy Danny, he's convincing me, he's pressuring me. No, I'm just kidding. No, he hasn't pressured me, but he's eager for us to get to the U.S. involvement. And I looked at the calendar and it's like, dang, I've been at this for like, I don't know, at least 1 year, maybe a little more. I think I started in the fall of 2023. So maybe, oh man, has it been 2 years? I don't know. I can't do the math right now, but it's been a while. So I think I've ironed out a lot of the kinks. I've got my process down. So when we finish up with this, I'm going to drop our U.S. involvement series, which is going to be, indefinite, as season 2. And everybody can start fresh with a new season and forget the bad episodes of this series, but hopefully have some, intrigue and interest in what's going on and a better understanding of the context by which it is that the United States gets involved in the first place. So anyway, let me get back on track. What are the 3 stages of this operation? Well, stage 1 is to gain a series of bridgeheads over the Red River Delta in the area just outside the Red River Delta. All right, so like usual, this is one of those things where it's really helpful to look at a map, but if you were to take a look at a map, you would see that the Red River Delta is kind of triangle shaped, and the northwestern corner of that triangle is really where this whole thing is going to start, in a place called Viet Tree. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So you gain a bridgehead, you're able to move troops. The whole point of moving these troops outside of the Red River Delta was so that they would spear north along 2 parallel avenues of approach. One of them was what's called Route Coloniale number 2, or RCE2. I'm just going to call it Route 2. All right, so one mobile group, which consists of like 3 battalions of infantry and a bunch of armor attached and engineers and artillery and everything else. It's like 5,000 troops, something like that. Mobile group would power north along the road. A riverine force would power north along what's called the Clear River. And at the same time, or at least within a very short window, a paratroop assault force of 2,300 troops would jump onto the town of Phu Duan. I think that's how you say it. 20 miles north. And then all 3 of these forces would conduct link up and seize control of this town, where it was known that there was a significant supply depot. Then, based on the results of this supply depot seizure, General Salon would determine whether or not Stage 4 would be enacted, and Stage 4 would be a push further north to what was known to be an even bigger supply depot. Now, like I said, the whole thing was, we're going to hit the supply depots, and then General Giap's going to be forced to divert a significant portion of his troops away from the west to come defend his supply depot, at which point they'll be caught in the trap and the French will destroy them, right? So anyway, it's a fair strategy. I mean, it's as good a strategy as you've got. The other strategies haven't worked out for the French so far. Having outposts in the middle of nowhere, they keep getting overrun. The Viet Minh are able to continuously harass the supply lines. uh, all throughout the country. It's a hybrid warfare mixture of guerrilla and conventional tactics. And every day they're getting better supplies and better, training and guidance from Chinese advisors. And as we're going to see soon, Soviet blockade. So as far as plans go and, and the logic behind this operation, it makes sense to me. It's an ambitious plan, but they've tried a lot of other things. This war has been going on for about 7 years at this point. So, you've been fighting a war for 7 years. You're going to do what you can. And this is what they decided, Operation Lorraine. Anyway, so in the process, they basically seize the town of Phu Duan more or less without a hitch. The original plan was for them to conduct link up within a 7-hour time span. That is, the paratroopers who landed on the town and the 2 mobile group forces and riverine force that's pushing up to meet up with them. Unfortunately for them, the French, the Viet Minh local militia and 2 dedicated regiments that General Giap had peeled off from 2 of his divisions out west were able to get into the area and conduct harassing operations against the bridgehead. So just think, you've got engineers building these bridges and you've got militias just, coming and hitting them, hit and run, standard guerrilla stuff. It's enough to make them slow down and take casualties, but not enough to stop them outright. Furthermore, they were able to place roadblocks. So the mobile group pushing up the road, had some difficulties, but it was nothing that couldn't be cleared out with a little engineering. And also, the French weren't ill-equipped, right? They had bulldozers. They did not have armored bulldozers, but they had bulldozers. So and other heavy equipment. So any kind of road blocks that they ran into, the engineers would get hard to work, clearing the road, rebuilding the road, whatever you have to do to make it passable for the vehicles. But this enemy contact delayed them from conducting link up with the paratroopers for 5 days. Fortunately for the French, this 5-day delay in the end didn't really amount to much, and they were able to seize a significant amount of weaponry. And this is where they made the first discovery of Soviet blockade introduced into the country in the form of Soviet-made Molotovas trucks. These were big, heavy transport trucks. While they only found 4 of them, and, it's not that big of a deal, right? Oh, cool, 4 heavy trucks. It signified for the first time confirmation that the Soviets were supplying the Viet Minh. And who knows what else, right? Like, you find one instance of Soviet support, you don't know what else, but you do know that one of the major superpowers of the communist world is getting involved. And you already know that the Chinese were involved. So the French intel community was kind of freaked out. This proved to be a bigger deal than it seems. And like all things, it's a small deal first, but then over time you realize, like, oh, this is a big problem. And we'll get into how big of a problem it is when we get towards the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the coming episodes. But anyway, I digress. In total, the French were able to pull 1,400 rifles, 100 Thompson submachine guns, 22 open bolt machine guns, 30 Browning automatic rifles, 40 light mortars, 14 medium mortars, 3 recoilless rifles, 23 bazookas, 1 Jeep, and, as I mentioned, the 4 heavy trucks, plus 200 tons of ammunition. Now, to put things into perspective, in Afghanistan, if you were to encounter a supply cache, you might find, like, I don't know, 100 rifles, a few 100 pounds of explosives, a dozen shells from the Soviet days, and you would call that like a massive cache. That's not anything. That's not anything compared to this cache, right? Like that's a minor, tiny little, oh cool, we found one little cache. This was a village worth caches all over the place. The paratroopers were able to jump and seize the town so quickly that the villagers had no time to pack up the equipment that they were sitting on. So when the paratroopers started clearing through the village house by house and searching it, all the stuff was there. It wasn't hidden that well, and they had no time to pack it up. And so basically, the plan worked perfectly, exactly as intended. And even though it took 5 days for the Riverine Force and the mobile group on the road to conduct link up with the paratroopers, for all intents and purposes, the plan had gone without a hitch. The only problem here was, where the hell is General Giap? So far, his forces had been nowhere to be seen. Obviously, like I said, the militia forces in the area and the detached regiment that had been dispatched to the area specifically for the purpose of harassing the French, had not proven to be the size that the French desperately wanted to find. They were looking for a fight, and the fight was not materializing. You had snipers taking pot shots, dudes dropping every now and again, but there was no force to be reckoned with. There was no force to draw into a trap and annihilate. Like I said, this depot is a huge find. So if you're a military planner and you find such a massive depot, you're like, well, hell, if this is what we found, 20 miles north of the Red River Delta, just think what we would find a few dozen more miles up the road closer to China. Like I've said many times, the Chinese were a known supplier of the Viet Minh, and the closer you get to the border, the more you're going to find supply depots. Just makes sense. So it was too good of a prospect for General Salon and the other military planners to give up on. So stage 4 is initiated, and the French decide that they're going to push further north along a very narrow and winding road up to the village of Phu Yen. Now, General Giap, like usual, was well on top of his game when it came to this whole thing. He had only dispatched 2 regiments from his divisions, which is not a very sizable force. If you think that the French deployed 30,000, these 2 regiments comprised maybe 10,000, and that's only if you include the militia forces and or semi-regular forces in the area that weren't professional soldiers per se. So needless to say, they were numbered by about 3-1. Okay, so it doesn't matter though, because like usual, they have the principles of guerrilla warfare on their side. They have a knowledge of the terrain, they have steep terrain, and they have the fact that if they encounter too much French firepower, they can fall back and blend into the bush, reconsolidate, reorganize, refit, and prepare for follow-on actions. But on top of that, General Giap had one more advantage in his column against the French in this case, which was that the Vietnamese intel was always pretty good, right? His intel network was pretty solid, pretty robust, and you can figure out basically how many troops are in an area, and based on that, you can extrapolate almost to a mathematical degree of precision exactly how far they can go before they stretch themselves too thin to be able to sustain their intended operation. As Bernard B. Fall puts it, quote, "The Communist High Command nearly always had a fairly accurate idea of French forces in any given sector and knew how many of those troops could be made available for mobile operations. Since the number of troops required to protect a given number of miles of communication lines also was a known constant, it was almost mathematically possible to calculate the maximum depth of the French penetration and its duration. On the French side, the dilemma of the choice between a deep penetration for a short time or a shallow penetration for a long time was never satisfactorily resolved. Operation Lorraine is a clear example of this dilemma." End quote. All right, so I just want to harp on one thing real quick, and that is the notion of the deep penetration versus short penetration concept. So previously in the war, and I'm not sure if I've discussed this in previous episodes, I think I may have, it was decided that let's not waste our time controlling terrain that we can't hold. Why patrol the mountains and the jungles that the enemy's going to slip by, and we're wasting a lot of time and resources, and we're stretching our supply lines and our air support. And let's just worry about the Red River Delta. The Red River Delta is where the food's at. It's where the money's at. It's where the port city Haiphong is. It's where the capital Hanoi is. It's the lowlands. It's easy to maintain and control with French vehicles and air power and fire support. But we need to be able to have a perimeter around the entire thing to prevent another attempt by General Giap to invade with a massive force like he had done 3 times earlier. So as a result, General de la Trobe decided that he was going to pour approximately 300 kilometers worth of blockhouses. What does that mean? Yes, individual bunkers, 1,200 total reinforced blockhouse concrete pillbox bunkers, like what the Germans were using to secure the coastline of Normandy, were poured in clusters of 3 to 6 and set in a way so that they were spaced out enough to have interlocking fields of fire. In total, there were about 250 clusters of these bunkers. They were all equipped with the ability to withstand 150 millimeter artillery fire from the Viet Minh. And they were all equipped with their own mortars, artillery, and machine guns. Some of the smaller ones would hold about, no less than 10 men. And some of the bigger bunkers could accommodate hundreds of men. They were surrounded by your standard mines and concertina wire, ditches, to make any kind of human wave attacks rather unsuccessful. The whole idea was we're going to perimeter off. Is that the word? Perimeter off? No. We're going to block off. We're going to build a wall. They built the wall, okay? They literally built a wall of bunkers around the entire Red River Delta in order to prevent any massive force from being able to penetrate through that line of defense and infiltrate into the Red River Delta. That's not to say that troops couldn't trickle in through covert means, but a massive force engaging in conventional warfare would not be able to steamroll through there without serious effort. And since they had no air power, that was basically not even an option for the Viet Minh, because as had been seen, napalm and dropping bombs on an enemy horde that's just charging into a bunch of bunkers that are also annihilating you with machine gun and artillery fire doesn't work out. It just doesn't. So, like I said, they poured 1,200 of these bunkers across a 300 plus kilometer range that enclosed the entire Red River Delta. Anyway, my point is that's how they were able to maintain control of the area surrounding the Red River Delta to a very shallow extent. But beyond that, it was all communist territory that they could not maintain control of. And at this point, you might be saying, well, okay, Stephen, based on that logic, why is the French concerned with way west along the Laotian border if they can't even reinforce it and resupply it and control it very well? To which I would say, good question. Excellent question, even. In fact, that is the question that ends up being the central theme of the investigation into why Dien Bien Phu becomes a thing. And for those who are just tuning in or who have no idea what I'm talking about, Dien Bien Phu is in this border region with Laos, and it becomes the battle that decides the fate of the war in favor of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. We're getting to that battle. It's super crazy. It's one of the craziest battles, at least in the modern era, just because of scale and duration, but most specifically consequence. It it decides the fate of the French in this war. It concludes their role in this war and sets the stage for the United States' involvement several years down the road. It goes back to the logic of, well, how do we maintain a deep penetration if we can't because of the harsh terrain and fact that the roads don't exist out that way, and the only way to do it is resupply it, but it's so far away that we don't really have the ability to continuously resupply it or cover it with air power. And also, by the way, and this gets forgotten in my case a lot, there's a whole section of the entire country south of northern Vietnam, central Vietnam, all the way down to the Mekong Delta that also needs French support, right? Like air support. So bottom line is, yes, good question. And the answer is the French didn't really have an answer. They were dealing with what they could. They didn't have what they needed in terms of people and resources to really wage this war as was required to actually succeed. They did with what they had as best they could, and as we're going to see in this case and later on, it was doomed for failure. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. The French pushed out to the town known as Yen Bay, which was the primary forward line of advance for the French in this case. But there was also another village called Tuyen Quan, which was basically on the same latitude as Yen Bay. It was just as the road winds a little bit further up the road for the French. And so they were never able to make it all the way to Tuyen Quan, but they did make it to Yen Bay. And the rest of that story is pretty boring. They pushed up, and it's about 30 to 50 miles up a winding road from Phu Duan. Well, so they post up there for a little while. They are waiting. They're looking around. Just imagine the French officer standing there with his binoculars in the sun. He's all sweaty, squinting a lot. He's looking on the horizon. They don't see nothing. There's no significant force amassing. And at a certain point in time, General Salon says, hey, we've extended our 30,000 troops far enough. The logistics to maintain that force, beans, bullets, fuel, etc., casualties, lines of communication, etc., is just too much to maintain. So we're going to call it a day, pack it in, and everybody's going to come back, head back to the Red River Delta. Everybody's like, okay, cool, roger that. They collapse it in, they pack it up, they mobilize their big, massive convoy, consisting of hundreds of vehicles, thousands of troops, and they start heading back through the very winding and narrow roads. And as you can imagine, it's perfect ambush terrain. Like I had already said, there were 2 dedicated regiments of Viet Minh that General Giap dispatched specifically with the purpose of preventing the French from being successful in this endeavor. General Giap's underlying philosophy throughout this whole war was, I'm not going to expend troops for troops that are already expended. If the foregone conclusion is that I've got troops that are going to get overrun by the French, well, they're on their own. Their sacrifice is noted. They did their best. They died for the cause. But I can't afford to send other troops and feed into the French plan to draw me into a set piece battle where they're going to kill me. That was his strategy all along. But anyway, these 2 dedicated regiments know exactly what they're doing, and they set up a massive ambush that's set to take place in a place called Chan Muong Gorge. So it goes without saying that an infantryman hates to hear the word gorge for a lot of different reasons, but the least of which are that it's a piece of canalizing terrain that spells certain death for anybody caught in an ambush. Anyway, the 36th Regiment set in place with machine guns, mortars, set up all along on both sides of the road, waiting for the French to squeeze through this narrow, canalizing terrain that's going to slow down a massive convoy. This gorge was about a 4 kilometer stretch that narrowed to about 150 meters. That's not to say that the road was 150 meters wide, not at all, but the gorge floor, the valley floor, was about 150 meters at its narrowest point. And all along the road were thickets that made it impossible for troops to walk through them with any degree of success. So everything was on the road, troops on foot and vehicles, obviously. In addition to machine gun and mortar emplacements on both sides of the road, there was an ancient Chinese fort sitting up on a hill that overlooked the road, and that is where the Viet Minh had set up their C2 node, command and control, so that they could coordinate the goings-on of the various units involved. Now, like I said, this is a regiment-sized unit, okay? This isn't a few men here and a few men there. This is like thousands of people on both sides of the road in emplacements with machine guns and mortars and rifles firing down onto one area. It may not seem like there's a lot of coordination that is required, but for the duration of the ambush, you've got to coordinate, resupply. Hey, boss, we're out of ammo. Hey, boss, we're running low. Hey, boss, we think we're going to run out in X amount of time. Roger that. We're sending people over to bring ammo, etc., etc. So you do need some coordination. Anyway, the shit hits the fan, obviously. Given the conditions that I've just outlined, the shit's going to hit the fan. All right, so that's the composition more or less of the 36th Viet Minh Regiment. Big old force for a big old convoy. How big of a French convoy are we talking about here? Well, the books don't specify exactly. Seems like the true exact total number has been lost to history, but we can get a ballpark estimate. The typical French mobile group was about 3,000 soldiers, and it consisted of about 3 to 4 infantry battalions and a company of artillery, maybe a company of engineers, a company of medical, plus the headquarters element. So about 3,000. In this case, there was 2 mobile groups. Mobile group number 4 was in front. Mobile group number 1 was in the rear. And in between, sandwiched in between, was the headquarters element, as well as an artillery element and engineers. And so in the middle, you got to think you've got command and control, support staff, like I said, artillery, lugging along huge artillery pieces on the back of trucks, plus all their extra ammo. The engineers, they've got their heavy equipment, bulldozers, cranes, that kind of stuff. So slow, lumbering, not infantry, not exactly the soldiers that you're going to have leading any kind of charge. And I mean that in the most respectful way. These are generally support soldiers, right? They're not the infantry. Not that matters a whole lot, but in this situation, as we're going to find, they were more ill-equipped to deal with what's about to unfold than some of the other units involved. But anyway, so like I said, you've got 2 mobile groups and you've got a headquarters element in between. Total somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000, and that's probably a conservative estimate. But based on what we know about the general composition, that's the best guess. All right, so that's an astronomical number of soldiers. For context, in this modern era of ours, what's going down in Iran right now, at least as of this recording, they're bringing in 2 MUSOCs, Marine Corps MUSOCs, which are about 2,200 soldiers, and about 2,000 more from the 82nd, plus a couple hundred special operations forces probably in there. So that's maybe about 6,000 6,500, 7,000 on the high-end ground soldiers in the Middle East, preparing to possibly invade segments of Iran. Context is everything, right? So Mobile Group number 4's leading the charge. In front, at the very tip of the spear in the Mobile Group, was a company of Algerians on foot. They were doing a detailed clearance of the road, looking for any signs of booby traps or the enemy. And at about 8:20 a.m. on November 17th, 1952, they encounter a bunch of boulders and tree stumps thrown in the middle of the road. It's obviously a roadblock, and everybody knows what's about to go down. All right, so at the time that they run into this roadblock, the convoy is stretched all throughout this gorge. This gorge, I think, as I've mentioned, is about 4 kilometers long, and the convoy itself is stretched about 2 kilometers. So right there, you've got a huge force stretched across a wide area. Kind of makes more sense now why the Viet Minh needed a whole regiment in place to try to hit this convoy. And even still, one regiment is maybe half the size of this 2 Mobile Group convoy. Not really enough when you go by the standard of a 3-to-1. But regardless, right about the time that the Algerians are noticing that this blockage is pretty big and there's not a whole lot they're going to be able to do about it, the first rounds start ringing down from the hills. Small arms fire, the clack, clack, clack of machine guns and rifle fire begins to pelt all around them, and everybody's in high alert combat mode. The ambush has begun. So within a few minutes, the Algerians requested support from an armored platoon that was back with Mobile Group number 4. Mobile Group number 4 says, Roger that, and they push up this platoon that's going to help clear the boulders and trees out of the way, as well as the whole 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Foreign Legion Regiment. That's a lot of dudes moving to the front to clear and to suppress the enemy that's shooting so that they can move the convoy ahead. Pretty much goes according to plan. They work at it for about 30 minutes, and by 9 in the morning, the convoy is on the move. Now that the convoy is moving along, the gunfire is not stopping, but at the very least, it's not causing a total stoppage, at least yet. Now, though the blockage was cleared, it's not really a great improvement to the whole situation, because even though the convoy is moving and it's moving in the right direction and they've got radio comms with the outpost at Tai Bin where they're headed, they're still driving the whole convoy through the kill zone. So the front part, the very, very tip of the spear, ends up making it out of the gorge and out of the real kill box. And that's all good and dandy, except for the fact that directly in the center of the convoy, directly in the middle of the ambush, is the headquarters unit, some medical staff, the engineers and all their heavy equipment, and some artillery pieces with pretty much the entirety of the artillery reserve ammo depot. It was at the exact moment that the central part of the convoy rolls into the valley that the warm-up act is over and the real hell lets loose. Viet Minh artillery and mortar pieces just unload absolute insanity on the entirety of the convoy that's still in the gorge. The deafening sound of all those artillery shells and mortars exploding in the valley, echoing off the steep rock granite walls of the canyon, must have just been unfathomable loudness. Anyway, while the central part of the convoy is getting hammered, actually everybody's getting hammered, but the central part of the convoy is especially vulnerable. Mobile Group number 1 that was pulling up the rear was just in the process of crossing a bridge when this all kicks off. And so it goes without saying, but a bridge is an extra choke point that just is going to further slow down any attempt at, shoring up gaps and reconsolidating forces to concentrate fire back up into the hills. And like I said, remember, there's fire coming down from both sides of this steep gorge. And as a side note, it should be noted here that Bernard B. Fall writes that some of the enemy pieces were as close as 50 yards from their targets. It was impossible for them to miss, and as a matter of fact, they didn't. Within a few minutes, one of the tanks exploded in a blinding ball of fire and trapped everything behind it as it blocked and burned in the middle of the road. So while Mobile Group number 1 is trapped behind a burning tank in the middle of the road and also trying to squeeze its way across the bridge while taking mortar and artillery fire, everybody in the front in Mobile Group number 1 is pinned down with their own problems to deal with, leaving the central part of the convoy totally exposed to the predations of the Viet Minh horde, which descends down out of the hills with such speed that a good chunk of them were killed by their own artillery, running into the kill zone of the road before the Viet Minh artillery had a chance to lift fire. But of course, in keeping with the Viet Minh strategy of breaking a few eggs to make a killer omelet, it didn't really matter. As the Viet Minh swarmed down, the artillery lifted fire, and those waves upon waves of infantry soldiers came down and started engaging in fierce, close quarters, no holds barred combat with the beleaguered French caught in the middle of the convoy. It goes without saying, but this must have just been the absolute most horrifying experience that one could ever find himself in. And as it turns out, the news of this chaos quickly came over the radio as it was reported that the Viet Minh were systematically pushing through the kill zone and executing any wounded French soldiers that they could find. Quoting now from Street Without Joy, quote, "While the communist troops finish off the drivers and headquarters troops with burp guns, hand grenades, and daggers, specialized communist saboteurs blew up the vehicles one by one. Within a few minutes, the French convoy had been engulfed along a front of 800 yards, with the northern and southern ends of the convoy fighting by themselves." End quote. So as you can see here, the Viet Minh have done an excellent job. They've segmented this massive convoy, stretched along a wild distance into 3 separate components, each essentially fighting for themselves, except for the one saving grace that the French had, which was that they had the discipline and professionalism to be able to maintain radio communication throughout the entire ambush. Furthermore, the French also had the nifty advantage of superior firepower and the ability to rapidly designate artillery targets that they could identify in the hills. So wherever they saw smoke plumes or wherever they thought they saw muzzle flashes, the radio guy was calling in artillery and airstrikes, and they were just hammering anything that they could find, but especially that big old Chinese fort sitting up on the hill, sticking out like a sore thumb. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that, hey, that looks like a good target to hit. And so they just started hammering it with everything they could. This, thankfully, disrupted the Viet Minh ability to maintain solid command and control over the ambush, and is probably a big reason for why they weren't able to annihilate the convoy outright. So, like I said, the whole thing kicks off at 8 a.m., but it wasn't until 3 p.m., 3 in the afternoon, that the French had managed to coordinate amongst themselves to develop a plan of counterattack to hopefully break the Viet Minh ambush and then get them the hell out of there. Okay, so the next part of this story really involves 3 main infantry battalions. The first is called the Algerian Rifle Battalion. Their role in this breakout plan was to just spread out and just hammer the hills with small arms, heavy machine gun, whatever organic weapon systems that they had on hand, and hopefully suppress the enemy enough. And likewise, the second big battalion in this scenario was called the Bataillon de Marche Indochina. I don't think I said that right. Whatever. The BMI, as it's called. The BMI was going to attack and secure gun positions on the eastern side of the road, while the 1.5 companies of the Foreign Legion Battalion that was caught in the trap would attack the 3 enemy hill positions towards the direction of the old Chinese fort. And a separate company of the BMI that wasn't assaulting up the hills would be clearing up the line of the convoy in the direction of travel, which was south, hopefully clearing out the road and making a way for the convoy to push through, i.e. pushing out all the dead vehicles, collecting up all the wounded, and getting the hell out of there. Now, I just want to reiterate here, we're talking about a counterattack in this ambush that was composed of 3 battalions of soldiers. That's like one whole mobile group's worth that's engaging in a counterattack. Obviously, you've got 2 mobile groups involved, right? But 3 battalions engaging in a counterattack is a big force. All right. It's so big that in the mind of a soldier who fought in GY, it doesn't compute. It boggles the mind. Not only that, but they're fighting a literal and figurative uphill battle. Like physics-wise, gravity sucks, but also like from a spiritual standpoint, they've been pinned down, just taking it since 8 a.m. in the morning, just getting hammered all morning long. And now it's like the middle of the afternoon, and they're going to go and do a counterattack where they charge uphill and try to dislodge the Viet Minh from their fighting positions. It's just like World War II level Iwo Jima type, just sheer nuts. And it's one of those stories which I'm proud to report because it's just so forgotten. But not today. So anyway, in a demonstration of their just pure professionalism and just ubermensch willpower and just good old-fashioned French elan, the BMI and the French Foreign Legion were able to coordinate, get themselves together, and disentangle from the brutal hand-to-hand combat that had unfolded around the vehicles, and then push into the hills according to the plan. At about 15:30, with the cover of tanks and heavy machine guns in their own convoy, the French, at least 500 strong, began to claw their way into the hills. As soon as French intentions became clear to the enemy, quote, the Viets in turn recalled their infantry from the road in order to gain free fields of fire for their heavy machine guns and mortars and their well-camouflaged hill emplacements, end quote. All right, so not to belabor the point, but if Bernard B. Fall says that more or less 500 strong were pushing into the hills on either side of the road, that's the BMI and the 2nd Battalion French Foreign Legion, then you got to think that that's probably about 200 to 300 from that other company in the BMI that was going to push along the direction of travel. So we're talking 700-ish, a lot of dudes. Anyway, the French Foreign Legion, for their part, they had I wouldn't say an easier go at it, but they had less distance to cover. And as such, they were able to make more progress clearing out their side of the road. Whereas the BMI, they had a distance that was maybe 2-3 times as long. And as a result, they got pinned down 3 separate times by Viet Minh artillery that was re-aiming and reorienting itself on the French, now assaulting up towards their positions. Now, here's the wild part. At 4:30 p.m., a sound that us in the modern era should seldom ever think to hear, they heard, and that was the sound of the bugle blaring through the hills, signaling fixed bayonet for a bayonet charge against the enemy. And in classic French elan and pure Ubermensch will to power, the French in this assault, the French Foreign Legion and the BMI specifically, they fixed bayonets and they charged up and they cleared out the Viet Minh, finally breaking them. The Viet Minh tucked tail and dipped out of there so fast that by the time the French had fallen on their positions, they were already gone. And as it turns out, interesting note here, the artillery pieces that the Viet Minh were used, pretty much all of them were destroyed on the ground by the infantry upon securing those enemy positions, and not by air superiority, airstrikes, or counter artillery fire. That's pretty cool. That's pretty crazy. And so for about the next 45 minutes, the French mopped up the hills, and every able-bodied man that was available worked to clear the road and clear out all the burning convoy and pick up all the wounded and pack everything up that could be salvaged to GTFO. Having been fighting continuously for about 9 to 10 straight hours, the French finally could breathe a sigh of relief, and they started moving down the road, heading on their way out to Tay Binh. But it was at approximately 1830 that some remnants of Regiment 36 had reconsolidated, reorganized, and planned another counterattack against the French, this time with bazookas and Molotov cocktails. Luckily for the French, they sustained very minimal damage, and French firepower was concentrated enough now that it quickly broke this final little remnant of the Regiment 36, which again receded back into the hills and disappeared under the shadowy dark canopy of the evening sky. It was at this point that the convoy commander, whose name I will butcher but try to pronounce, it was Colonel de Krgaravat. He said, "Enough is enough. We're not stopping until we finally make it to the town of Ngoc Thop." And it wasn't until 22:30, that's 10:30 p.m., that the convoy finally made it out and had approached true friendly lines where they could sleep easy that night, knowing that they weren't just going to get continuously ambushed all night long. And the whole event had lasted for about 18 hours. The ambush at Chan Muong had cost the French 12 vehicles, including a tank, 6 half-tracks. In terms of casualties, 56 killed in action, 125 wounded in action, 133 missing in action. Now, that's a big number, about 300-ish casualties total. But compared to the size of that convoy, it's almost a miracle that they didn't take greater casualties. I mean, you're talking about a force of maybe 5,000 to 6,000 dudes rolling through that convoy. They could have easily taken way greater casualties. And I think the reason they didn't is because there was just too few of the 36th Regiment to cover such a wide kill zone. Remember, the convoy had stretched for 2 kilometers, so it was a classic case of just too much ground to cover with too few individuals. But still, textbook ambush, notable for its massive size, both attacking and defending. That's the Viet Minh attacking, obviously, and the French defending themselves on their way out. But lest you thought Operation Lorraine was done, negative. Operation Lorraine doesn't wrap up until December 1st at which point they blew up the bridgeheads right outside of Viet Tree, and the entire force fell back to the relative safety of the Red River Delta, protected by the notorious and rather large De La Tra line. When it was all said and done, Operation Lorraine had cost about 1,200 casualties. That's a regiment size of casualties, a massive, massive amount of people. But on top of that, it was ultimately a strategic failure, where they did have a minor tactical success and disrupting General Giap's supply lines and obtaining a huge cache. General Giap's forces were not in any way seriously diverted from their tasks at hand in the West. General Giap's forces were not goaded into a set-piece battle where they would be annihilated. Furthermore, this whole month-long crusade just tied up resources that could have been used elsewhere in the country, especially air support and other troops that could have been manning the De La Tra line or engaging in other parts of the country. And it's easy for me to forget there's still the whole rest of the country where there's activities going on. Operation Lorraine goes down in the history books as being a strategic failure. That is going to position us for the final stretch. And next episode, we're going to skip through about 15 months of French history in Indochina and get straight into Dien Bien Phu, the conclusive battle that ends the war for good. It's epic. We're going to have maybe 2 or 3 episodes to really cover Dien Bien Phu, and then we're going to get right into the United States' involvement. It's going to be dropped as season 2, so we can start fresh with a new slate, and I look forward to bringing you guys every bit of chaotic and glorious, but also gory details of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Talk to you next time. Peace.